Let's start with the lesser-known vigilantes and slowly walk our way up to the most ruthless one on the list. Number 6, the White Hand Gang. Before the Mafia dominated the streets of New York, another group ruled the docks with iron fists and bloody knuckles. The White Hand Gang. These guys were the rough, brawling, whiskey-soaked kind of criminals, and if you crossed them, you'd probably end up face down in the East River. Formed in the early 1900s, the White Hand Gang was made up mostly of Irish-American immigrants who had no love for their Italian rivals, particularly the rising Black Hand, the early version of what would become the Mafia. The Irish had been running the Brooklyn waterfront for years, and they weren't about to let some newcomers take over. Led by Denny Meehan, the White Hand Gang controlled dockside rackets, extorted local businesses, and settled disputes with fists, knives, and bullets. Meehan ran the gang like a tight ship, keeping things organized and making sure money flowed where it was supposed to. But even the best captains can't stop a storm, and for the White Hand Gang, that storm came in the form of Al Capone and the Italian Mafia. The feud between the Irish and Italians got real bloody, real fast. Bodies started turning up in alleys, floating in rivers, and disappearing altogether. But the biggest blow came in 1920 when Meehan was assassinated, shot to death while sleeping next to his wife. Some say it was an inside job, others say the Italians had finally made their move. Either way, Meehan was out, and that left a power vacuum in the gang. Stepping up to lead was Wild Bill Lovett, and if his nickname didn't tell you enough, let's just say this guy wasn't exactly known for his patience. He took the war against the Italians to the next level, but the problem was, he wasn't much of a strategist. He was more of a shoot first, ask questions, never kind of guy. That made him unpredictable. Whoa, that was close. And in the world of organized crime, unpredictability is just another word for expendable. Lovett eventually met the same fate as his predecessor, murdered in his sleep. His second-in-command, Richard Pegleg Lonergan, tried to keep the gang together, but by then it was clear. The Italians were winning. The final nail in the coffin came on Christmas Eve 1925, when Lonergan and his crew walked into a Brooklyn speakeasy and never walked out. The place was owned by none other than Al Capone's allies, and by the time the shooting stopped, the White Hand Gang was finished. Number 5, the Montana Vigilantes. The Wild West was never for the weak, and in the 1860s, Montana was about as wild as it got. Gold had been discovered in Bannock and Virginia City, bringing fortune seekers, outlaws, and every kind of opportunist you could imagine. And with no real law to keep order, criminals ran the show. Murders, robberies, and lawlessness weren't just common, they were expected. If you had gold, you had a target on your back. At the center of the chaos was Henry Plummer, Bannock's sheriff, who was supposed to be upholding the law. But here's the catch. Plummer wasn't just failing to stop crime, he was running the most dangerous gang in the territory. His secret network of road agents, known as the Innocents, had been ambushing miners, robbing stagecoaches, and leaving a trail of bodies across the region. Travelers were disappearing and gold shipments were vanishing. With the law as useless as a bucket with no bottom, the people took matters into their own hands. In December 1863, a group of outraged citizens formed the Montana Vigilantes, a shadowy, no-nonsense group dedicated to justice. Their version of justice. The rules were simple. If they caught you robbing or murdering, you wouldn't see a jail cell, you'd see the end of a rope. Over the next few months, the vigilantes hunted down Plummer's gang one by one, hanging suspects from trees, gallows, or whatever was available. Their most infamous moment came in January 1864, when they finally caught up with Henry Plummer himself. The sheriff-turned-gangster tried to plead for his life, but the vigilantes had already made up their minds. Without a trial or hesitation, they marched him to the gallows, the same gallows he had built for criminals, and hanged him. By the time the dust settled, the Montana Vigilantes had executed over 20 men. Some hailed them as heroes who had saved the region from lawlessness. Others saw them as little more than a more organized gang, killing without trials and deciding guilt on the spot. Either way, their brand of justice changed Montana forever. Number 4, the Regulators. During the late 19th century, when the Wild West was still untamed and justice was a loose suggestion, a group of men decided they'd had enough of lawlessness running rampant. These men called themselves the Regulators, and if you were on the wrong side of them, well, let's just say your days were numbered. The Regulators were formed during the Lincoln County War in New Mexico, a brutal conflict that started like most blood feuds do, over money, land, and power. The whole mess began when a wealthy businessman named Lawrence Murphy and his associates controlled pretty much everything in Lincoln County, including the law itself. When a rival faction led by John Tunstall and Alexander McSween tried to break their monopoly, things turned deadly real fast. Tunstall, a British rancher, was gunned down by men working for Murphy's crew, and that's when the Regulators were born. They were a group of young, gunslinging outlaws turned vigilantes, sworn to avenge their fallen leader. And leading the charge, a hot-headed, trigger-happy outlaw named Billy the Kid. Now, Billy the Kid wasn't your average gunslinger. He was quick on the draw and even quicker to put bullets in people who crossed him. Under his leadership, the Regulators went from being a ragtag posse to a full-fledged war machine. They tracked down the men responsible for Tunstall's murder and started serving their own brand of justice, frontier style. The conflict reached its boiling point during the infamous 5-day battle in Lincoln, where the Regulators found themselves barricaded in McSween's house, surrounded by Murphy's men and a small army of law enforcement. Bullets tore through the building as the place caught fire, and by the end of it, McSween was dead. The Regulators were scattered, and Billy the Kid was on the run. After the Lincoln County War died down, some of the Regulators vanished into history, while others, like Billy, kept up their outlaw ways. Billy himself would eventually meet his end at the hands of Sheriff Pat Garrett, but by then he had already become a legend. Number 3, the Bald Knobbers. Back in the 1880s, deep in the Ozark Hills of Missouri, a group of men decided they had had enough. Crime was running rampant, outlaws did whatever they pleased, and the law was as useless as a screen door on a submarine. So these men did what any reasonable people would do, formed a secret vigilante group, and started handling things themselves. They called themselves the Bald Knobbers. Now, don't let the strange name fool you. These guys were not to be messed with. Decked out in horrifying black masks with twisted devilish horns, they looked like something straight out of a nightmare. And if you were unlucky enough to cross them, you probably weren't going to see the next sunrise. Their method of justice? A tight noose and a tree sturdy enough to hold your weight. At first, the Bald Knobbers were seen as heroes, cleaning up towns where criminals ran wild. But as history loves to remind us, when a group of men start deciding who lives and who dies, it's only a matter of time before things spiral out of control. Soon, it wasn't just bandits and outlaws meeting their end, it was anyone who got in their way. Didn't vote for the right politician? Bald Knobbers. Owed someone money? Bald Knobbers. Looked at a member the wrong way? You guessed it. Bald Knobbers. Of course, this didn't sit well with the people who weren't too keen on being executed for minor inconveniences. Then came the anti-Bald Knobbers, a group that decided if vigilantes were going to play judge, jury, and executioner, then somebody had to return the favor. Before long, the hills were dripping with blood. Ambushes, midnight shootouts, and revenge killings turned the Ozarks into a war zone. The government finally stepped in, realizing that maybe letting masked men run the justice system wasn't the best idea. Several Bald Knobbers were arrested, with some sentenced to death. The most infamous of them all, Nat Kinney, was gunned down in 1888, the same way so many of his victims met their fate. Number 2, the Guardian Angels. In the crime-ridden streets of 1970s New York, where the subways were dark, dangerous, and practically lawless, one group decided they had seen enough. They weren't cops, they weren't gangsters, and they weren't waiting around for help that would never come. They were the Guardian Angels, a group of fearless, streetwise civilians who took matters into their own hands. Founded in 1979 by Curtis Sliwa, the Guardian Angels didn't just report crime, they actively stopped it. Dressed in their signature red berets and white t-shirts, they patrolled the streets and subway cars, unarmed but ready to throw down if necessary. These weren't trained officers, just regular people willing to step in when the law wouldn't. And in a city where muggings, assaults, and murders were an everyday occurrence, they had their work cut out for them. New York was drowning in crime, and the NYPD was either overwhelmed or uninterested. The Angels would ride the subways, spotting pickpockets and stopping attacks in progress. Sometimes it was as simple as their presence scaring off criminals, other times it meant full-on street fights. Of course, not everyone loved them. The cops saw them as reckless vigilantes, and politicians weren't too happy about a group of civilians making them look bad. Even the gangs weren't sure what to do with them. After all, the Guardian Angels weren't fighting for territory or profit. They were just fighting back. Over time, they expanded beyond New York, popping up in cities across the US and even worldwide. Some people saw them as heroes, others as troublemakers, but one thing was certain, they weren't afraid to stand up when no one else would. Number 1, Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Born in 1954 in Santa Rita do Sapucaí, Brazil, Pedro's life was violent from the start. His skull was damaged before he was even born after his father kicked his pregnant mother during an argument. By the time Pedro was 13, he had already committed his first murder, shooting the vice mayor of his town after his father was fired from his job at a school over a theft accusation. And that was just the beginning. Pedro then tracked down the actual thief, another school employee, and executed him, setting the tone for the rest of his life. From that moment, he decided that criminals didn't deserve to live, and he made it his personal mission to rid the world of them. By the time he was 18, Pedro had already taken down multiple gang members and drug dealers, but his most personal act of revenge came when his own father brutally murdered Pedro's mother with a machete. Rather than call the cops, Pedro paid his father a visit in prison, stabbed him to death, and just to drive the point home, cut out his heart and took a bite out of it. At 19, Pedro was finally arrested and sentenced to prison, where he kept killing. He didn't care about reform. He believed the prison was full of criminals who didn't deserve to breathe. By the time he was done, he had murdered at least 47 inmates behind bars, including a notorious rapist whom he butchered on his very first day in jail. Despite all of this, Pedro was released in 2007 due to Brazil's maximum sentencing laws, which limited his prison time to 30 years. But old habits die hard. He was rearrested in 2011 on new charges and spent more time in prison before finally being released again in 2018.